unconscious human beings, emergence of knowledge, realization of death and suffering, and the elimination of the paradise, right? Okay, so now I'll read you the story of the Buddha. The father of Prince Gautama, the Buddha, savior of the Orient, determined to protect his son from desperate knowledge and tragic awareness, built for him an enclosed pavilion, a walled garden of earthly delights. Okay, so the story goes that an angel visited Buddha's father and said that he's going to have a son, and the son is either going to become the greatest ruler that the world has ever seen or a spiritual leader. And the father, being a practical man, thought, well, there's no bloody way. I want my son to be some like wandering spiritual leader. I want him to be the greatest king that the world has ever seen. Okay, and so the father decides, how am I going to get my son to be the greatest ruler the world has ever seen? I better get him to fall in love with the world, because then he's not going to go traipsing after some sort of half-witted spiritual knowledge. He's going to stick to practical tasks, right? That's something that a father should do to some degree, is orient you in the world, right? And maybe you shouldn't subvert your spiritual development to any great degree, but there's a practical element to this. And so anyways, that's how it works. And so that's what happens. The father builds this city of perfection, and he eliminates from it everything that's a reminder of the suffering that's associated with life. So the only thing that's allowed, the only creatures that are allowed to be in there, the only people that are allowed to be in there are healthy, young, and happy people. So the Buddha grows up surrounded by nothing but the positive elements of life. Well, you think, well, what does that mean? Well, it's akin to the paradise idea, obviously, walled enclosure of paradise where there's no death, but there's more to it than that too. It's also in some sense what a good father would do. What do you do with your young children? Well, you don't expose them to death and decay at every step of the way, right? You build a protected world for them, like a walled enclosure, and you only keep what's healthy and life-giving inside of it, and you don't expose them to things that they can't tolerate. You know, maybe you don't take a 3-year-old to a funeral. Now, maybe you do, but maybe you don't. There's things that you don't expect them to be able to cope with. You regulate what they're allowed to watch. You're not going to show them the Texas Chainsaw Massacre when they're 4 years old, right? So you're staving off knowledge of mortality and death. And so he's just being a good father in many ways here. All signs of decay and degeneration were thus kept hidden from the prince. Immersed in the immediate pleasures of the senses, in physical love, in dance and music and beauty and pleasure, Gautama grew to maturity, protected absolutely from the limitations of mortal being. However, he grew curious, despite his father's most particular attention and will, and resolved to leave his seductive prison. Well, it's that curiosity element. It's the same thing that lurks in the Adam and Eve story. It's like God tells Adam and Eve, see that tree over there? Don't be bothering with it. Well, you know what's going to happen with human beings, especially if there's a snake associated with it. They're going to be over there right away checking that place out. And that's exactly what happens with the Buddha. It's like he's raised to be healthy. And what's the consequence of that is that the fact that he's healthy makes him look for what's beyond the protected confines of the thing that made him healthy. It's like even in the Geppetto story, you know, where Geppetto paints on Pinocchio's mouth and he's ready to go. He puts him outside the next day and Pinocchio's ready to run away with all the kids, right? So the consequence of raising a child in a healthy way is that the child is going to be curious enough to go out there and look for some trouble. And we actually know that because there is follow-up studies of teenagers. You imagine that there's teenagers who never break any rules. And then there's teenagers who break all the rules, okay? These teenagers don't do very well. Introverted, depressed, anxious, depressed. Sorry, I said that twice. These ones are antisocial. The ones in the middle, that's what you want. You want your damn teenager to get out of the paradisal confines of your house and to go cause some trouble and to investigate. Maybe you don't want to know about it any more than you have to. You don't want them to be breaking rules all the time, and you don't want them to be so timid and oppressed that they can't make a move on their own and never make a mistake. So the paradoxical thing here, and it's sort of echoed, this is why I like these two stories back to back, is like, if you give people what they want, then the first thing they're going to do is try to get beyond it. And Dostoevsky says the same thing in Notes from Underground. He says if you gave people everything they wanted, pure utopia, so he says, so that they're sitting in a pool of bliss with nothing but bubbles of happiness coming up from the surface, and all they have to do is eat cake and busy themselves with the continuation of the species. Dostoevsky's observation is, the first thing that people would do is find something to smash that with, just so that something interesting and perverse could happen. It's like, well, yes, we're creatures that are designed to encounter the unknown. We want to keep moving beyond what we have, even if what we have is what we want. And maybe that's partly because we're oriented towards the future. We think, well, this is great, but it's not good enough. It's great, but it's not good enough. There's always something more that drives us forward. Well, so that's what happens with the Buddha. He gets curious. He sees the walls. He thinks, well, there's walls. There's probably something outside of those walls. So then he goes to his father. And he says, I want to go outside. What's outside? And his father says, nah, you don't want to go outside. And Buddha says, yeah, well, I really do want to go outside. And his father knows that unless he lets him go outside, he's going to climb over the walls. And so the father decides he's going to let him go outside, but he's going to fix everything out there first. So he goes outside. It's like the Chinese preparing for the Olympics, you know, when they sprayed the grass with green paint, got rid of all the homeless people. It's the same thing. So he goes outside the city and he tells everyone, all right, old people, sick people, dying people, hit the road. We don't want to see you for a while. Clean all this out. We want the attractive people around the sides of the roads, like waving palm fronds and all of that. And so when my son comes out, he's going to see nothing but what's good. And so he gets that all arranged and he lets his son go outside. Now, his son goes outside in this little chariot thing and he has someone with him. Now, unbeknownst to his father, that person that's with him is an emissary of the gods. And so in a perverse way, he plays the same role as the serpent in the story of Adam and Eve. And the gods have already arranged so that the father's care is going to be insufficient. And it's the snake in the garden idea. It's like no matter how much care you take to make things perfect, some of what you're excluding is going to come back in. So anyways, Buddha goes outside and he's in his chariot, and preparations were made to gild his chosen route, to cover the adventurer's path with flowers, and to display for his admiration and preoccupation the fairest women of the kingdom. The prince set out with full retinue in the shielded comfort of a chaperoned chariot and delighted in the panorama previously prepared for him. The gods, however, decided to disrupt these most carefully laid plans and sent an aged man to hobble in full view alongside the road. The prince's fascinated gaze fell upon the ancient interloper. Compelled by curiosity, he asked his attendant, "What is that creature stumbling, shabby, bent and broken beside my retinue?" And the attendant answered, "That is a man like other men, who was born an infant, became a child, a youth, a husband, a father of fathers. He has become old, subject to destruction of his beauty, his will, and the possibilities of life." "Like other men, you say?" hesitantly inquired the prince. "That means this will happen to me?" And the attendant answered, "Inevitably, with the passage of time." Well, that's the end of that party. The world collapses in on Buddha and bang, he hightails it home. Well, what does that mean? Well, that's what children do, roughly speaking, is they're around their mother. They've got security there. They go out into the unknown. They encounter something that's just a little bit too much for them. Bang, they come home. They get all patted back into shape and hugged and taken care of. Hugging children and patting them is actually analgesic. It actually reduces pain. Unsurprisingly, that's what you do with someone who's grieving, right? So you hug them because grief is pain. So they, you pat them, they get rid of their pain, they get rid of their anxiety, you calm them down, and what happens? Well, the next day they want to go out again. Well, that's exactly what happens to the Buddha. So he's all shorted out by his encounter with death, which is very little different than what happens to Adam and Eve, runs back, recovers for 6 months. He has post-traumatic stress disorder. He runs home and he recovers for 6 months, right? In time, his anxiety lessened, his curiosity grew, and he ventured outside again. This time, the god sent a sick man into view. "This creature," he asked his attendant, "shaking and palsied, horribly afflicted, unbearable to behold, a source of pity and contempt. What is he?" And the attendant answered, "That's a man like other men, who was born whole, but who became ill and sick, unable to cope, a burden to himself and others, suffering and incurable." "Like other men, you say?" inquired the prince. "This could happen to me." And the attendant answers, "No man is exempt from the ravages of disease." Once again, the world collapsed and Gautama returned to his home. But the delights of his previous life were ashes in his mouth, and he ventured forth a third time. The gods in their mercy sent him a dead man in funeral procession. This creature, he asked his attendant, laying so still, appearing so fearsome, surrounded by grief and by sorrow, lost and forlorn, what is he? And the attendant answered, that is a man, like other men, born of woman, beloved and hated, who once was you, and now is the earth. Like other men, you say, inquired the prince, then this could happen to me? This is your end, said the attendant, and the end of all men. Well, that's the end of childhood, right? There's no going back after that. It's like Pinocchio, it goes back. There's no one home anymore. There's nothing that your father can do to protect you from knowledge of death. There's no returning to the childhood unconsciousness because you now know, and there's no going backwards. Suicide, that's going backwards. That's how you replace your emergent self-consciousness with the old blissful unconsciousness. And that's exactly what suicidal people wish. They're going to destroy their painful self-consciousness and make it all go away. The world collapsed a final time, and Gautama asked to be returned home. But the attendant had orders from the prince's father and took him instead to a festival of women occurring nearby in a grove in the woods. The prince was met by a beautiful assemblage who offered themselves freely to him without restraint in song, dance, and play in the spirit of sensual love. But Gautama could think only of death and the inevitable decomposition of beauty and took no pleasure in the display. Well, so you see the parallels between one story and the other. They have the same underlying structure. Initial paradise, partly childhood, partly unconsciousness, the emergence of knowledge of mortality into that, and the demolition of the paradise. It's the same meta story that we've been talking about all along. Ordered state, collapse into chaos. Well, the rest of the story is the return. Like in the Bible is actually set up that way. It's collapse into history, and then a movement upward. The question is, what's the movement upward? That's the question here. When the collapse is caused by knowledge of mortality and the emergence of self-consciousness and knowledge of death, is there any manner in which redemption can be attained? Or is that the final, does that finally demolish you? Well, that's the question. And it's the answer to that question that entire civilizations constantly pursue. And the question is, well, what is the answer? And part of the answer is identification with the spirit that generates order out of chaos.